Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 2. Now, this is when we are going to get into the thick of the concepts that we are going to discuss for the rest of the semester. Now, today's topic is going to focus on Aristotle's rhetoric, and what we're going to examine today will really help you with understanding what you'll need to do for Project 1, your rhetorical analysis. Before we begin, take a moment to gather the following lecture assignment materials. First, you'll need a document to write on. Now, how you go about this is entirely up to you. If you want to just create a running document right now of all of your lecture summaries and assignments, or if you want to create independent documents and then copy and paste them into one later, however you approach that is up to you. Just make sure that when you submit it, it is in one .doc file. You'll also need access to the Project 1 assignment description. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. First, we're going to define the term rhetoric. Next, we'll understand rhetoric as the key tool for persuasion. And finally, we'll explore Aristotle's proofs as rhetorical tools. Okay, so first thing is first, what is rhetoric? We often hear this term thrown around, and unfortunately, it has gained kind of a negative reputation in our culture. But really, at its core, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. It is how we are able to, as speakers, as writers, as individuals with a message, it's how we're able to convince others to accept our way of thinking or to prompt them to go about carrying out a certain action. That's essentially what rhetoric is. It is how do we persuade others. Now, when we break rhetoric down a little further and explore exactly what it means, it's understanding your audience and utilizing the appropriate and available means to persuade that audience to action. Now, rhetoric also, in performing a rhetorical analysis, it's an attempt to understand how an artifact is persuasive. Exactly what is the speaker or the writer doing in order to get the audience to accept their way of thinking or encourage them to perform the action that the speaker or the writer wants. Now, rhetoric is everywhere in our day-to-day lives. Now, again, oftentimes when we think of rhetoric, we think of political rhetoric. We think of politicians or elected officials saying, oh, that's just rhetoric. And of course, we definitely see rhetoric in political contexts, but we also see them in commercial advertisements. A company is trying to persuade you, is trying to get you as the consumer to buy a certain product or invest in a certain service. So they are trying to persuade you to do something. We also can see it if we look at it in a more professional way in a grant funding application. Let's say that you're a biology major and you want to do some research, let's say out at Zion. You'll need to write a grant funding request to a certain organization. You need to persuade them why you are the best group or person to receive that funding and why your project is worth the time, the energy, the effort, and the finances that'll go to support it. Another way that we can see rhetoric is an email requesting a later due date. So imagine if you're trying to persuade one of your instructors to say, hey, can I have an extra day on this assignment? You are thinking about who you're writing to, and you are saying, what is going to convince them to accept my argument on having a later due date, on pushing it back, let's say, a day. So even though a lot of the times rhetoric is associated with more of the political sectors, we see it all the time, and it is constantly around us as we live, I guess you could say, in a society of persuasion. Now, there are a lot of ways that we can discuss and explore rhetoric, but I think one of the greatest ways to lay a foundation regarding what rhetoric is, how we can see and determine how rhetoric is used to persuade an audience, is by going pretty much all the way back to the beginning and examining Aristotle and his views of rhetoric. Now, Aristotle is known as the granddaddy of rhetoric. That isn't to say it certainly didn't exist before Aristotle, because it did, and it certainly existed outside of the Greek city-states, but Aristotle, at least in Western terms, is the first one to really sit down and concretize different types of rhetorical strategies and exactly defining what rhetoric is. So he was kind of the first person to do that. So when he talks in On Rhetoric, um, even though he really gets into what rhetoric is and explores it in really great detail, some of the key takeaways that scholars, academics, writers, speakers have really gravitated towards, and I think for good reasons, are his artistic proofs. Now, those are the suggested three components for successful rhetoric, and that's going to be your appeal to logic, your appeal to emotion, and your appeal to authority. Now, Aristotle says that when you can put these into concert well and cater them toward your specific audience, you have a greater chance of persuading them, again, to accept your line of thinking or to take up the cause or the action that you are suggesting they do. So let's break these down into a little bit more detail. So the first we've got is logos, and that is appeal to logic. Now, logos, we could take a whole semester exploring logos, to be frank. However, for the sake of this class, we are going to look at it in terms of its appeal to facts, numbers, statistics. So again, you can certainly go through and explore logos in greater detail, look at things like inductive and deductive reasoning. But a lot of those concepts are better reserved for more of a philosophy class or more of a strictly rhetoric class. But for the purpose of English 2010, we are going to frame it as, its appeal to logic through, again, facts and statistics and the more quantifiable data. So if we look at this argument, we could say Leonard Nimoy, who's the original Spock. Leonard Nimoy is the most successful member of the original Star Trek cast because he has appeared in the original series and 8 franchise films. So when we look at it in that respect, we are making the argument to say, hey, Leonard Nimoy is the most successful. Of course, people can counter that. People could say that maybe it is William Shatner for whatever reason. So of course, people can counter that. And so in order to establish our argument, we're relying on logos to say, hey, he's the most successful because, and we're pulling from facts, we are pulling quantifiable data to say that he appeared in the original series and 8 franchise films. And so you can see how we are using statistics, how we're using numbers to really solidify our argument there and to make it more logically acceptable for our audience. The next that we want to look at will be pathos, which is going to be your appeal to emotion. Now, I think this is one of the most commonly seen appeals. Now, logos and ethos, and we'll explore ethos in a bit more detail in just a second. While we certainly do see those, they can typically be a bit more difficult to tap into. Pathos is more readily accessible, easier to identify with your audience, and so again, we see it more frequently used. So yeah, it's your appeal to emotion, and Aristotle breaks this down a little bit further and actually proposes 2 overarching categories that we can use to start really pinpointing what kind of emotions are being invoked and how that contributes to the message overall. So he breaks it down into 2 categories, happiness and anger. So when we think about happiness, think about the messages in whatever, you can pull on whatever example you want. Happiness is often associated with emotions like hope, acceptance, joy, patriotism, pride, love, things of that sort, kind of the feel-good emotions. So, if you're watching a commercial that says, hey, you should donate to this, it's because you can feel better. You can feel like you have helped or that you have provided a service or resources to others. And so you can sort of feel that pride in yourself. Or let's say a certain candidate says, you should vote for me because these are the ideals of the community I want to serve. So in that regard, you might feel a sense of patriotism, but ultimately you're feeling some kind of positive emotion. Now, on the flip side of that, we see anger, and oftentimes, you'll see sadness, fear, panic, anxiousness, frustration, isolation, things of that sort. A good example that I always try to return to when with anger, and even though it might not immediately connect with anger, you think about the ASPCA commercials where they show images of mistreated and abused animals. As the viewer, as a member of their targeted audience, they want you to feel sad, of course, about what's going on. They want you to feel angry that it's happening, and they want you to use that emotion as kind of a turning point to say, okay, I accept their argument that this is occurring, but I also will take up what they are suggesting and I will donate to them. And then even that might lend into happiness because then you feel pride for helping eradicate this problem that made you feel so angry. And so again, you can definitely see how pathos is really, how it is seen as one of the most accessible of the three in terms of appealing to your audience. Final appeal that we are going to discuss, the final of the three artistic proofs would be ethos. And that, simply put, is your appeal to authority. So what this really comes down to is your trustworthiness as a speaker. And because of that, Aristotle actually argues that ethos is the most important of the three artistic proofs. His reasoning behind that is you can have the most suitable facts and statistics. So your logos can be on point. Your emotions that you try to invoke in your audience, they can be absolutely appropriate. But if your audience does not trust you as the speaker, they are going to be skeptical and critical of your appeals to logos and to pathos. So if your audience doesn't trust you, they may wonder and say, oh, well, they're using these numbers to appeal to logos. I'm a little skeptical on that. I don't know if I believe the certainty of those numbers, or if you are trying to make them feel happy or sad or joyous or isolated and they don't trust you, they may feel like you're trying to emotionally manipulate them, and that will be more clear, which might deter them from accepting the argument you're providing. So yeah, Aristotle says your logos and your pathos can be absolutely perfect, but if your audience does not see you as trustworthy, then it really doesn't matter. Now, ethos can manifest actually in a couple different ways, and what this really comes down to is the relationship between the speaker and their audience, or the writer and their audience. So first, the speaker, him or herself, holds credibility. So think about it this way. A priest is seen as authoritative on religious doctrine because of their title and their line of work. So if a priest is to say to you, oh, this is what it says in this religious text, you're more likely to believe them because you can say to yourself, all right, they have spent how many years studying in the seminary, they have participated in how many church events, they have dedicated how much time in their life to studying this topic. So of course they're going to be knowledgeable. Of course they are going to be authoritative on this particular topic. They even achieved a title that speaks to that authority and a title that speaks to the knowledge that they possess. And so you'll often, you can see it in that way as ethos manifesting in the speaker holding credibility themselves. The second way that it manifests is the speaker introduces major minds in the field. So this is going to be more commonly This is going to be more what we see in this class, and what you are going to see as you engage with different academic sources later on in the semester. People are trying to build their credibility on a certain topic by citing other experts, and citing other individuals who are also knowledgeable and trustworthy sources of information on a particular topic. So an example of that might be a teenager is speaking to a congregation and quotes the priest. So while the teenager might be met with skepticism, if the teenager were to say, this is what it says in this religious text, some might say, oh, this person's just like a kid, they're just a teenager, they haven't really studied it or don't have the life experience. But as soon as the teenager says, oh, and this priest, our priest, backs me up on this, then they're more likely to say, oh, they understand enough to use this priest's quote within the proper context. So maybe they have done their research. Maybe they have been able to really understand the concepts they're speaking on. And so even though the teenager did not go in holding authority to their audience, because they were able to introduce big minds in the field, in this case the priest, then they are seen as more credible, more authoritative, more trustworthy to the members of their audience. So now we're going to see how we can apply logos, pathos, and ethos in texts that we engage with every day. What we're going to do is we are going to watch this campaign ad. It's called Doors by MJ Hagar. She was a congressional candidate down in Texas during the past midterm. I don't believe she won, but her ad is actually considered one of the best political ads in recent memory. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch it, and then we're going to discuss how she is using logos, pathos, and ethos to convince her audience to vote for her for the seat that she's running for.
This is a story about doors. A lot of them. And that's me, MJ Hagar, an Air Force combat veteran and a mom. This door behind me is from my Pavehawk helicopter. It's all that's left of the aircraft that I was flying that day. I was on a rescue mission in Afghanistan as a combat search and rescue pilot. I heard the windshield crack and realized I'd been shot. But I continued the mission and airlifted the patients out. After taking even more fire, we crashed a few miles away. But my story begins much earlier. One of my first memories was of a door, but it was my dad throwing my mom through a glass wall. 3 years later, Mom got the courage to walk out the door, and she opened a new one for my sister and me here in Texas. And it was here that I put my foot on the gas and followed my dream to be a pilot. And that meant opening, pushing, sometimes kicking through every door that was in my way. I signed up for ROTC at UT, then I was commissioned as an officer in the Air Force. I served 5 years in aircraft maintenance, working on the F-16 and the B-2. I managed to get one of only a handful of slots for flight school. Then I spent a year training to fly. I flew water drops over wildfires in California, and eventually served 3 tours in Afghanistan. And then, the crash. 2 Army helicopters rescued us from the wreckage. I strapped myself to the skids and returned fire on the Taliban while we flew to safety. That got me a Purple Heart, and I became the second woman ever awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor. But after that, the door closed. Injured and unable to fly, I was barred from my next career choice because I was a woman. So I came home. I worked in healthcare and business, I got married, and started my family.
Wait, barred because I was a woman? That's ridiculous.
So I sued the Pentagon, but not just about that job, about the ban on women serving in all ground combat jobs. And I went to DC to lobby Congress, but door after door was slammed in my face. I heard things like, my boss agrees with you, but you aren't in a position to do anything for him. You're not one of our donors. Well, eventually,
we are eliminating the direct ground combat exclusion rule for women.
we won. And that opened the door for hundreds of thousands of women to compete for elite ground combat jobs. A major victory for our military. Hold on, back up a minute. Not one of his donors? That's not how this is supposed to work. One of those closed doors was my congressman, Tea Party Republican John Carter. Apparently, being his constituent and a veteran wasn't enough to get a meeting. I guess I also needed to be a donor. So now I'm running against him, taking on a system that cares more about campaign donors and political parties than protecting our country. Congressman Carter hasn't had a tough race his entire career. So, we'll show him tough, then we'll show him the door.
Now, when we watch that video, her argument right out the gate is vote for me for Congress. So she is calling her audience to action to say, okay, well, when voting day comes around, please check my name off instead of my opponents, or instead of voting for anyone else, vote for me. So that is her argument overall. Now, let's unpack how exactly she does that using logos, pathos, and ethos. So when we first look at logos, and of course, these are just my observations, you might have noticed other things as well. But just very briefly, when we look at logos, we first hear it in the numbers that she's using. How many tours that she did in Afghanistan, how many women had received the Purple Heart like she had. So we can definitely see her starting to use this quantitative data, these facts and statistics out there. How she said, I was one of, a few, I was able to get into flight school and there were only a handful of open slots, which to the audience says, okay, it was very competitive, there weren't a lot, the number itself is few. So even though there wasn't an exact number, because she's framing it as there were few slots for a lot of applicants, at least that's how she's rhetorically framing it. Again, we can sort of get a sense that, okay, the number of accepted applicants was small, but she was among them. Now, when we think of pathos, I think, again, we can definitely see how pathos really shines, especially in commercial advertisements and political advertisements. Now, remember, she's campaigning in Texas. Now, Texas as a state, of course, sort of has this reputation for being very patriotic. And that is something that as a state, they very much embrace. And so she is appealing first and foremost, I think, to patriotism and national pride by saying, hey, look, I've been in the military. I've helped put out wildfires across the country. And so she's really setting herself up as someone who has given back to the nation and has really felt a pride in the country. And so she wants her audience to feel that exact same way. She wants them to feel that patriotism alongside her. And basically there is sort of this implied, oh, hey, if you want to feel patriotic, then you're voting, by voting for a veteran, you can then feel very patriotic by doing that. And you can vote for me in order to achieve that feeling. There is also a sense of anger and frustration that later in the video she definitely communicates through the fact that women were barred from serving in combat roles. And so the audience is supposed to feel anger and frustration over that, but then she responds to that by saying, hey, I tightened my bootstraps and I went and rallied to get that changed. And so that sort of puts the audience more in a happier state of mind by saying, oh, if we vote for her, not only can we feel patriotic, but we can feel confident. We can be, rest assured that this is a person who will actually do things. So we can definitely see how pathos is very much being played into being invoked for the audience. And of course, you've also got things like her saying, I'm a mom, I'm a veteran, I'm this, I'm that, which are things that are going to emotionally resonate with her intended audience. And last but not least, we have ethos, so her authoritative appeal or her appeal to authority. She really does focus on her military service and the accolades that she received during her time in the military to basically say, I understand, the issues that are facing the country in this capacity. I fought for change, regarding certain aspects of military life. She, by saying that she has received the Purple Heart, by saying that she has flown, how many combat missions and how many tours in Afghanistan, that's really setting her up to be this person who understands, how the United States military works and what is going to be best for them. So she's really building her credibility there. And she really finalizes that push by saying, oh, and I've taken my experience and I've actually put it to use in that I have prompted change where because of my lobbying, basically women are now eligible for combat roles. So we're seeing, once we start to break these things down, look at the language that she uses, the images that she utilizes, the examples that she's citing in her text. We start to see how she is supporting that argument, how she is getting the audience on board with voting for her, with following through with her call to the audience by saying, hey, vote for me because I have served this many, tours in Afghanistan. I have been able to lobby Congress for change. You'll feel patriotic in doing so. I'm an experienced combat veteran. So you can see how her argument that I am the better of the two candidates, vote for me, you can start to see how she is putting her audience in a place where they are more willing to accept that. So this is essentially what you're going to do for Project One. You are going to first say, okay, well, what is the argument at hand? What is the speaker or the writer, what are they trying to get the audience to think or do? So that's just the first part. But then what you want to dedicate your work primarily to is, how do they go about doing that? How do they go about effectively doing that? And we can use Aristotle's artistic proofs of logos, pathos, and ethos to really focus in on certain aspects of the text to say, okay, well, this is persuasive because it makes the audience feel happy, or it makes the audience feel frustrated, or because they're citing someone who's done a lot of research on this topic, or the information that they provide is the most up-to-date relevant statistics on this issue. So again, by using logos, pathos, and ethos, we can see exactly how the speaker is convincing their audience that their argument should be accepted. Okay, so let's talk lecture assignment. What I would like you to do is I would like you to review the 4 available artifacts on the Project One assignment description. Now, when I say artifacts, I basically mean videos, articles, cartoons. There are a wide variety of modes available to you on the Project One assignment description. I want you to review all 4 of them, and this is your opportunity to become familiar with them and to really say, what one do I want to write my analysis on? After you've done that, I want you to select one of the appeals, be it logos, pathos, or ethos, your choice, and briefly discuss how each of the artifacts attempts to meet that appeal. So for each artifact, your write-up, your discussion should be about 30 words. It doesn't have to be terribly extensive. Of course, if you want to go over that, you're certainly welcome to. But you don't have to write me a novel. I just want to see that you are understanding how logos, pathos, or ethos is being used in each, and that you can effectively demonstrate that you understand the appeal that you've decided to write on. Okay, so for your weekly homework, what you're going to do is you're going to include the core lecture 2 summary and assignment in your week 1 homework submission. Now, overall, your week 1 homework submission should include the following: the core lecture 1 summary, the core lecture 2 and 3 summaries and lecture assignments for both of those, and then a mini lecture of your choice, a summary for that, and whatever lecture assignment goes with it. Just make sure to have it in by Sunday. If you have any questions or if you would like to discuss these concepts in further detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.